We now move to the next presentation here at Innovation Nation, and I can think of no better person to present on the subject of innovation than the Executive Chairman and Chief Strategy Officer of OpenText, Mr. Tom Jenkins. Tom leads one of Waterloo's corporate gems, OpenText, a company with a worldwide leadership position in enterprise content management. But beyond his corporate role, he's also lending his expertise as the chair of the Government of Canada's Research and Development Review Panel. He's also served as a member of the Government of Canada's Competition Policy Review Panel and the Province of Ontario's Ontario Commercialization Network Review Committee. At the University of Waterloo, he serves as a member of the Engineering Dean's Advisory Council. In short, Tom is that perfect example of how we can build bridges between business, academia, and government to lead us to a more innovative Canada. Tom is here to give us his presentation on an Innovation Nation.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. When I was asked by our organizers of today's session, I was faced with quite a dilemma. Because the panel that I'm currently working with does not report to Minister Goodyear for another 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So I can't speak about that. However, the Minister asked us many questions about something I would characterize as downstream in the innovation chain that we've talked about today. And I must say that much of the conversation and some of the points that you've heard today are really what myself and my colleagues on the panel heard through the past year. So I'd like to congratulate the organizers for presenting in a very short period of time a very good tour of this subject. What I would like to do, however, is take you upstream a little bit and actually take you to some previous reports that were generated during the time of successive minority governments and to review what some of you may consider to be economic recommendations, that they may in fact have a very fundamental impact on innovation. And I apologize, Ian, I tore it out of the book. I'm going to follow a lot of a paper that I wrote in Ian's book that is part of your package. So let me start with that. Motivation for this, reports on this topic, the major insights of these reports, and what to do about it. Always have to reflect when you begin something, to look at something humorously. A crow was sitting on a tree doing nothing all day. A small rabbit saw the crow and asked him, "Can I also sit like you and do nothing all day?" The crow answered, "Sure, why not?" So the rabbit sat down on the ground below the crow and rested. All of a sudden, a fox appeared, jumped on the rabbit, and ate it. And of course, the lesson here is to be sitting and doing nothing, you must be sitting very, very high up. And that is a huge dilemma for our country, and you've heard that many times today. This is the sad reality of some of the references that have been made about our productivity. And as the ministers both have remarked, this is a problem that has its origins many decades ago. So if you're going to do an archaeological dig on our lack of productivity, the source is actually a generation ago. Roger Martin, of course, has done a lot of work on quantifying what does this mean, because unfortunately in our public discourse, when we say, oh, our productivity is lacking, well, most Canadians think, oh, well, that means my boss wants me to work more for less. That's what they think. That's what Main Street thinks. And Roger's done some work to quantify this, and in fact, he's shown, and Kevin has written in some of his papers, the impact to the country on our GDP is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Hundreds of billions. So if we look at that productivity chart and start to put it on a macro level, it's variously about 300 billion is usually the estimate. But if you look at it for a person, it means $12,800 for mortgage payments each year. So if we can start to quantify how this is impacting everyone, because when we speak about the quality of life of Canadians in the future, I would put to you the quality of life has already been impacted. Just because we're doing well now doesn't mean we could have been doing better. Now, innovation's tricky, and to quote maybe one of our other wellsprings of knowledge is hockey. A good hockey player always plays where the puck is. A great hockey player plays where the puck is going to be. And of course, Wayne Gretzky said that, and that's very much applies to our strategy around innovation. Now, another great Canadian, Peter Nicholson, did some fine work with the Canadian Council of Academies. And he presented to us a very compelling view of a very complex problem. Innovation, and what are all the different pieces and cogs in the wheel. And what I'd like to do is focus on the thing that I've circled here, called competitive intensity. Because in our country, we speak about this. We speak about competition. In fact, almost every panel member alluded to a certain motivation or that type of thing. And economists like to call that competitive intensity. We speak about it, and then we move on downstream. I would put to you, and what I'd like to put to you in the rest of this presentation, is that if we want to engage the private sector, trust me, I'm from the private sector and have spent my entire career there. I don't wake up in the morning thinking about, well, how can I be more competitive today, or how can I be more innovative? When I wake up in the morning when I brush my teeth, I worry about what the other fella is going to do to me today, and what can I do to counteract that. For Canadians, this is a very base, visceral, this is competition, this is in the jungle. And many times, we do not perhaps want to talk about that. The reality is competition is hard. It's very hard. And it is, I would assert to you, the elephant in the room in many of our discussions about innovation. We want more R&D investments. We want our entrepreneurs to have more ambition. We need more productivity. The reality is we need more competition. So, reports on this topic. We've got many. The next report that will come out will be the R&D panel's report, and it'll do a good job examining many of the downstream issues and answering, to the best of our ability, the questions that the minister gave us. But there are many reports. I referred to Peter Nicholson's report. Great group of Canadians were behind Peter's report, and many others. It was mentioned, for example, the Global Competition Policy Review Panel, led by Red Wilson. I'm going to bring a couple of those slides so that you can see them and maybe reflect on them through the prism of innovation, even though many of these reports were in fact economic. A foundation principle that you heard today, but was not voiced this way, but it is a foundation principle that competition leads to innovation, which leads to productivity. That's a foundation principle in all those reports. So let's talk about the major insights from these reports. Global value chains. These value chains have changed in the world. They used to be nation-state value chains. They're now international. We've already seen it in international finance, but quite frankly, most of the sectors of the world economy now are global. OpenText, as was mentioned, it's a company I've been part of. 97% of our revenue comes from outside of Canada. We may be Canada's largest software company, but we have spent, and in fact many of you know that try to get hold of me, I'm most of the time outside my own country because that's where my customers are. So you have to realize if we're going to play in this game, this is a tough game, and it's an international one. Here's our dilemma, of course, the rise of BRIC. As many of us know, BRIC is variously, depending on the country, between double and triple the growth rates and will be sustained for decades to come. The march of these numbers on a compound basis is unassailable. And yet, look at this. 3% of our total exports are going to BRIC. We are not prepared for this. One could argue that perhaps we are not competitive enough to be able to sell our wares in those countries because we are already failing the innovation and global competition test. And yet, there is hope. Roger Martin shows that, interestingly, our global leadership among private sector has grown from 15 companies to 42 last year. So there's great hope there. But there is a vexing dilemma in his statistics. Less than 10% of these global leaders come from sectors with protection regimes. Canada is not an open market. And there's good reasons why, but it's a discussion we must have. We have variously, but the Wilson report listed these 6. We have enshrined in legislation at various levels, both at the national and provincial level, 6 protected regimes. And there's a good reason why we have them, and I'll come to that in a second. But remember, there is a constraint of competition in 6 major sectors of our economy. Why is that? Well, as I mentioned before, and not surprisingly, our productivity started to take a dip 30 years ago. Why? Because at that time, the previous generation made an economic strategic decision to build Canada from a national economy to a continental economy. And so many of you remember the discussions around NAFTA and the free trade agreements and what have you. And time has shown that that strategy was a good one for Canadians. We benefited greatly. It opened us up. And it did cause an increase in competitive intensity in the sectors, think of automotive, etc., in the sectors where there was open competition with the Americans. And there was good reason for doing this, because less than 10% of the continental market was going to be Canada. As we all know and joke, Canada's just 300 million people short of a real market. And yet, we had to have some controls because we were dipping our toes into this big pool, because it was understandable that we would want control of our national sovereignty. And if you recall the debates of that era, it was a balance between the two. So the selected sectors that were protected and enshrined in NAFTA and various other exemptions were and are integral to the infrastructure of Canada. But therein lies a great dilemma, because if they're integral to the infrastructure of Canada, they are enabling sectors. So they're not just like any other sector, they enable all the other sectors. So when you think about lower productivity in an enabling technology, that has a multiplicative effect when you come higher into the more applied sectors. Many of us know this from research and what have you, but it's also true here. And of course, in those 30 years, the world's changed dramatically. The internet did not exist. We called it the information highway for those of us that were starting to work in the area. And certainly mobile devices, and certainly BlackBerry and iPad did not exist. And yet they are having a transformative effect on productivity throughout the world. Why do we all own that technology? Because we can do things faster, better, etc. And yet, and by the way, I encourage you to look at more recent data, because this data has changed, but I'm restricting myself to just reports that have already been published. And if you look at this, this is a woeful penetration rate. And think of enabling sectors allowing someone in mining or food production or culture to be competitive with the rest of the world. If our penetration rates and costs of enabling technologies are at a disadvantage, then it logically follows that those sectors are at a disadvantage. So sectoral regime issues, they were created prior to the internet. Think of the copyright and the patent that we talked about earlier and that legislation. And most importantly, 30 years ago, policy interventions could by and large be considered to be surgical. As a policy person, you could probably say, well, you know, I can do this in telecommunications or I can do that in broadcasting and not affect things. And yet, when we talk about mobile phone rates, we're really not talking anymore about phone calls between people. We're talking about purchase orders. We're talking about engineering drawings. We're talking about much, much more than just two people talking to each other. So poor productivity in an enabling sector will undoubtedly lead to poor productivity in other sectors. So if we go back to our foundation principle and think about that logical flow, suboptimal competition will lead to suboptimal innovation, which will then, of course, lead to suboptimal productivity. And yet, here's the conundrum. Canadian firms over the last 50 years have enjoyed better returns on investment than their American counterparts. So think about that for a minute. Because on the one hand, we're saying the sky is falling, the productivity against the Americans, very poor. And yet, we're doing quite well, thank you very much. And why is that? Well, that's because if you're running a company in Canada and it has lower competition, you have a certain amount of pricing power. And you